May I now request the distinguished speakers for this session on technology and the Ukraine war, opportunities and challenges, to please come on stage. The session chair, Mr. Nandakumar Sarvade, is the former CEO, Reserve Bank Information Technology Private Limited. Our panelists are Mr. Pranay Kotasthane, Deputy Director, Takshashila Institution, Mr. Madhukar Kotwal, former Director, Larsen & Toubro, and Mr. Saikat Datta, Founding Partner, DeepStrat. Over to you, Mr. Sarvade.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be facing all of you and talk on a topic which probably should be of interest to everyone. We're really blown away by the morning two sessions and wondering, can we make it as interesting and in a post-lunch session that too. So hopefully we'll do our best, but we'll look forward to your inputs and questions to enliven the proceedings as we wind down this session later. So having looked at the foreign policy and the economic aspects of the situation as created by the ongoing war, let's look at the technology aspects. And it's very interesting that this kind of a topic gets included in this conference. And probably also inevitable because by far technology is the most transformational force facing today ahead of climate change, demographic changes, nationalism, and so on. That being the case, I think we need to really understand how technology is playing its part in the current war, the sanctions especially affecting technology supply chains, and the impact on the normal activity which it has caused, and what we can learn from this and how we can profit from this, of course. So if you were to look at the way the war has broken out and played out, and how technology has played its part in covering the war, creating and debunking the war propaganda, the open source intelligence which is being used, and the kind of innovation happening in adapting drones and other technology artifacts for the purposes of war is really a fascinating study. And as we know, open source intelligence itself has become such an evolved area. You will recall the famous case study of how a person who was not in national intelligence or military intelligence was able to locate the location of a military base based on just these Strava patterns that he was seeing of in the middle of nowhere. And obviously the conclusion was, though the Google Maps didn't show anything, it was a military base which was being operated from there. I think the availability of satellite imagery, the logistic logs, and the connecting the dot ability is something which is growing all the time. And I'm sure my colleagues have more to say on this, how the new war is so dependent on information technology flows. And but this is something which, again, we need to keep in mind about how even things like war crimes being documented and archived for eventual prosecution. This is something which I don't think any military had reckoned with, and now we hear those kind of projects being undertaken. We have, of course, seen earlier international criminal tribunals doing very painstaking investigations, but that is always post facto and dependent on very traditional physical forensics. But now we actually have a lot more digital evidence being made available to for eventual processes. Now, the most interesting part to me seems to be the rise of the Ukrainian IT army. And it's very interesting to see how it kind of came into being. Within 2 days of the war breaking out, young people in Ukraine, including the minister himself, who was 36 years old, they raised this call for recruitment by just uploading a Google form for anybody who was interested to volunteer and capable of volunteering to enroll and be part of the IT army. And they initially went into just denial of service attacks to be launched in a coordinated manner. Now, the way they went about was to create a Telegram channel, which almost had 3 lakh members, which kind of dwindled down later to 2.5 lakh. But put the IP addresses and the port numbers on the channel for people to, and giving timing, saying that, okay, in this time, the attack will be launched. And you will use these tools. The tools were made available on public repositories like GitHub. And there were detailed tutorials on how to download these tools and use them. So this went on, and this also created some very interesting situations about non-segregation of civilian and military targets, because many of these websites were meant to serve the civilian population needs, but they were attacked and kind of brought down. And there was complicity, if we can say the word, from companies like Microsoft, which owns GitHub, and Google, which was hosting a form which was clearly saying, let us carry out denial of service attacks on Russian sites. So this blurring of what was legitimate and what is not, and this will have implications for all subsequent wars, has been something which has been observed. Now, another thing which I thought was of interest was the way the Chernobyl plant was taken over by the Russians, but had to be kept running because of the implications of not maintaining the operations of the plant with severe consequences. And the question would be, in another war, if nuclear plants were to be made targets of such an attack, by sheer removal of the personnel who are trained to operate such a plant, what would be the implications of those kind of situations? And if that kind of scenario were to be planned for, how countries will go about it. So I think the challenges are not only in IT and software, but also in other technologies. Supply chains, of course, has been something which has been observed. The sanctions have really impacted the Russian supplies of aviation-related technology in particular, but also other technologies which are dependent on the IT aspects. So with that kind of background, I think for us in India, the questions that we have are, obviously nobody is saying, okay, will we go into war with the superpowers? Obviously the consensus has been that we have to work together in a globalized world. It is in our interest to work towards that, but also to be as resilient as possible for any kind of adverse actions. And how do we plan for that? Also, if there are opportunities of now stepping in for supplying certain kind of advanced electronic equipment, are we ready, or will we be ready in 3 years' time down the road? And how are we affected by especially the chip shortage which is there? Our industry has been impacted. Of course, this has been an ongoing discussion I heard for many years about how we should set up chip plants in India and what kind of investments are required, and do we have enough demand, and the whole ecosystem which will enable that. So those discussions have been there, but I think they will acquire a new urgency now that we have reached this situation. So some of these questions, I would request my panelists to pay some attention and give some thoughts around those. But we'll look forward to a vibrant discussion. We have a very distinguished panel. Mr. Kotwal comes with long experience from having been a board member in L&T, and I'm sure his thoughts around defense preparedness, defense production will be of great interest to us. Saikat, he runs DeepStat. His specialization is in special forces operations, and Pranay works on, especially the silicon supply chain aspects and other tech policies. So I would request Pranay to start the discussion, and I would request you to speak for 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll go into the subsequent discussion. Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So, given that all of you have had good lunch and a big, nice modak, so I'll try to make this as short as possible and as breezy as possible. So, what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to be talking about 3 implications and 5 opportunities for India based on what has happened in Ukraine. So, I guess we can frame the current problem in 2 ways. One, look at the impact of technology on war itself, and second, look at the impact of the war on India's technology sector. So these are 2 different ways to look at it. I am going to focus on the second one. So look at what is the impact of this war and generally what's been happening on India's largely technology sector, and I'm going to be focusing on supply chains of semiconductors and other areas which require global collaboration. So that's what my mandate is. So getting to the implications, right? So the 3 implications I want to talk about is first, the proximate impact of this war on India's technology sector, especially say semiconductors, etc., is not likely to be much actually, in the sense that there are price rises in neon gas. There are also price rises in palladium, which is used for making chips. But it's not as if Russia was a big manufacturer. There have been price rises. And what will happen now is more supply will come online because there have been price rises. So there will be impact in terms of prices, but it's not something that cannot be manufactured by others. So markets will take care of that. I think there's one area where there will be significant implications is defense tech, and I think Mr. Kotwal will talk about that in more detail. But I just want to emphasize that apart from economic sanctions, there are also stringent export controls. And if you look at the BIS report on the kinds of export controls which are there on Russia now, even if they wanted to give India transfer technology, that ability to do that will be significantly dented going ahead. So for example, chips that were being used are meant for Russian defense, or Russian defense companies are now coming under a license which by default says, no, you can't get it. And this doesn't just apply to American companies, but this applies to any company in the world which is using American technology to make these chips. So these are like sort of secondary export controls. So think of it as what happened to Huawei, but this is happening at a nation state level. So that's the impact. And even if Russia has the best intentions to do a lot of tech transfer, I think that ability is dented because of what has happened. So that's my one proximate impact point. Now, going to a larger, broader perspective, I think there are 2 larger implications or lessons for India. And I'm limiting myself to the high-tech sector. I think one important lesson is that plurilateralism in this area is a necessity and not a choice. We can talk about a lot of things that we have to build in India as well, but we can't stretch the logic of Atmanirbharta way too much and disconnect ourselves from a lot of the global supply chains. Often when I argue this, there have been, what has happened with the war is there is this idea that, just see what kind of sanctions were applied on Russia, and we also have to be aware that such kinds of sanctions can be applied on us, and that's why we have to do lots of things back home, right? But think of it this way. First of all, that sanctions argument comes from a memory of what happened post-Kargil, etc. But the sanctions which were applied post-Kargil and what has happened to Russia are qualitatively very, very different. One is state-to-state sanctions, but here it's not just state, it's states, markets, society coming together to sort of punish an invasion, right? So there are significantly big differences between them, and I don't think they are comparable. So this fear that something like this can happen to us is overrated in my view, and I think the better way to approach would be that, that yes, technology and trade are getting strategic, so can we plug into the supply chains and the global ecosystem which can give us more benefits rather than divorcing ourselves from it. So that's the second point. The third implication that I wanted to discuss is a lot of times now with this war, what has happened is because it was not just done by the state, there were many companies which pulled out of Russia. There were also some open source libraries which sort of got denied, Russians were denied access to it, etc. So because of that, there is a feeling that, this is sort of a full spectrum warfare which extends not just on the military domain, but across all realms. But I would think from an Indian perspective, the way we should think of it is, this is the way information age politics will be in the future, and versus thinking of it as a full spectrum warfare. Now the difference is crucial, because when we think of this as full spectrum warfare, the only response to a warfare is to do everything ourselves, right? We would say, we don't want to be dependent on anyone, we have to do a lot of things ourselves, but we know these supply chains are way too complicated for us to do everything ourselves, right? So in the sense, what I would say is that if we look at it as an information age politics thing, where now with everyone wanting to be a part of contributing to a war effort, it's just like, when things happened in Ladakh, there were also some Indians who broke TVs, right? The Chinese TVs. It is of that domain as an information age politics operation, which is not so coordinated by the state from the West, but it is an act where a lot of people want to get involved into this action. And they can, because they are part of this network community, right? So I would say, if we look at it from that perspective, then we start thinking of what should India do, not just in terms of building our capabilities, which is important, but also in terms of cooperation, competition, conflict, etc., right? And how do we use, in all the areas of knowledge creation, human capital, influence, raw materials, and also norms. So these are like three implications, I think, for Indian high-tech sector, which is important. Okay, quickly going to the 5 opportunities. They are not all related, but I thought it will be useful to think of opportunities going ahead. So, Dr. Mashelkar said about future needing solutions of the future. So I was thinking in terms of how should we imagine new solutions for what has happened. So one idea is that we should think of becoming a vital node in global technology ecosystem and building strengths and links with countries which have which have sort of what you can say, similar values, similar interests, broadly, and also economic complementarities, right? So Mr. Sarvade talked about resilience, right? So resilience does not mean that we have to do a lot of it ourselves. It also means that we have to deny something which, let's say that we don't want China to be leading in one narrow part of the supply chain, which only China can do. As long as we can prevent that, whether it is through cooperation, whether it is by doing ourselves, the goal of resiliency will be served, right? It's not as if it requires everything to be done by ourselves. So that is one point I thought, thinking ourselves as a vital node in the global technology ecosystem, which requires more imports, more exports, more transfer of ideas, etc. The second point I think is important is to look at our digital public infrastructure. So now India is leading in some of these areas, so whether it is payments, identity, we have good solutions at least. So I think there is a case to be made of trying to get this digital public infrastructure to a broader world, right? And I know government is already trying that, but many times we are trying to achieve too many objectives with this particular instrument. So there are a lot of talks about, we will allow someone to use the, code base for, let's say, payments which we use, but then even Indian companies should have access, let's say, in France or other countries when they adopt it. But I think attaching too many objectives to this one instrument will be problematic. It's just, even if this Indian digital public infrastructure goes and other countries are just able to use it without Indian companies getting access, it still gives India a lever which we don't have currently, right? So there are users of Indian built ecosystem, and that serves India's purpose from a foreign policy perspective. The third opportunity is, given the kinds of investments which we are seeing in the US, Europe, given everyone's trying to divorce themselves from China, there will be a lot of high-tech sector worker shortage. And there is already lots of reports which talk about how there are lots of money is put, but we don't have the engineers, we don't have the people who can think through some of these areas, right? So the idea is, and this is what Nitin mentioned in the last one also, I think India should advocate the free movement of people, knowledge, and capital, and ideas, and also human capital movement is sort of very critical. So this is the third point. And I guess the government's role here is signaling that this is important, but not much beyond that. It's just like in software, people started doing some things in the 20, 30 years ago, then we now have our own products, right? Similarly, if there is a lot of collaboration with the top ecosystem of the world, there will be people who will make great products in the hardware space in India as well. So it is highly likely, and it's not as if we need to, we are sort of losing out just because there are people going in other countries in these sectors. So this is the third point. The fourth one I wanted to mention about the opportunity, and I think this is an interesting opportunity that we at Takshashila have been thinking about, that in order to protect quote-unquote strategic autonomy in the technological domain, India championing open technologies can be really, really useful. So I say this because our previous responses to, let's say, operating system in which we have been closed is to get an Indian government entity to build its own version of Linux software. Now, no one's going to use it. Very few people use it. At least outside India, they're not going to use it. So we need to think of it in a different way. And a 21st century solution to this is to back some of the big open source projects which are there across the world. So for instance, there is a very good operating system called Ubuntu Touch. Now, it is an open source software which is a replacement for Android, Google, whatever, right? So now if we are able to back it, for example, as a premium partner in the foundation which runs it, the creation of that alternative to a locked ecosystem benefits not just India, but the entire world, and we build resilience, not necessarily by doing that 50 people getting together only in India and doing that. So that I think is important. Another area which this has already happened is on instruction set architectures which are used on our phone processors. So there's just one company, ARM, which literally runs 95% of the processor designs which are there on our phones. But there are now alternatives coming like RISC-V, which does a lot of, it's an open source ecosystem, came from a university in the US, but China is now heavily backing that, right? And even Indian government is now sort of trying to back this foundation which is developing this instruction set architecture. I think that is one way to go ahead. These kinds of global open tech projects, if India can back, I think we will develop one arm of developing resilience, right? It won't solve all our problems, but it will give us a backup at least. The final point I would like to say, and yeah, this is open to contention, but I would say that there is more possibility of critical tech transfer to India from the West today than it was ever possible before. Ever before. The reason why I say this is, again, because the way the West is now looking at China and the idea, we saw that in the example of AUKUS as well, right? The critical tech transfer on nuclear submarines, etc., gives an indication that there is different kind of thinking which is emerging in the West as well. So I think India should take that opportunity. We should position ourselves as an independent actor, but in the high-tech sector with a strong bias towards the West, because that sort of serves our interest. Purely for our interest, this is the good way to go, and I think we'll be able to do a lot of, get a lot of tech transfer that way. And I would say that a lot of people talk about Taiwan, South Korea, etc., but if you trace their developmental journeys, especially in the technology domain, a lot of that has happened because of close collaboration with the West. There was tech transfer from RCA, etc., which led to a emergence in Taiwan. Even for Samsung, the technology transfer came from the West, etc. So more collaboration on that will help us start our own ecosystem. So those were my 5 opportunities. So to sum it up, sort of, the proximate impact, I would say, in the high-tech sector is not much except defense tech. And there were 2 broader lessons, and I just put down 5 opportunities which India can think of. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranay. I think opportunities always welcome 5 or more, and it will be interesting to look at those. You mentioned digital public infrastructure, and as we know, in the finance sector, we have seen a lot of these innovations happening, and the great success of UPI, people feel that should be replicated in other countries. It can be exported as a technology, and to NPCI's credit, they have set up an international subsidiary to do that. But many times, if you see the example of Israel, their embassies and consulates actually have very strong such program where they take they arrange their vendors to come and meet customers. They have this annual, especially in cybersecurity, this annual conference, very prestigious, where universities and the security industry are showcasing their what they have to offer, and their delegations which are organized. I think the Indian Foreign Service should look at those kind of opportunities for something which is now made in India, ready for export, and can be deployed, and which will earn us a lot of goodwill because it makes those local systems much more efficient. In this case, as you might know, the Russian system was cut off from the SWIFT system. The SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide Interfund Transfers. And so there was a talk about, there is of course an alternative system which was set up by China, and Russia has joined that. So there is a fallback option available. But given the Indian capability in this field and the open sourcing approach which Pranay mentioned, there is a significant contribution we can make to this area if we have adequate ambitions. The other thing I wanted to mention was about the physical infrastructure itself. I'm just purely talking of connectivity. And if you saw in what happened in Ukraine, the internet was something which went down in some places, and we all know how Elon Musk stepped in and provided those Starlink supply. And interestingly, that worked very well for the Ukrainians because of their ability to project much better. And if you see the IT Army's job description that they posted out, they actually not only have people who create content, but also those who can book good ads on Google and Facebook. So that itself is a skill where to place your ads. And they were savvy enough to really leverage those kind of skills. So when you look at those kind of very emergently put together kind of teams and their capabilities, I think in India we can do a lot on those lines. We of course have this example of how India Stack has come about with a lot of contribution in the vision and strategy space itself. And whether it is good enough to extend to other areas or there are other initiatives required to be taken up is something we need to think about. But let's now come to the opportunities part in the defense production space, and I'll request Mr. Kotwal to share his thoughts with us.
A very good afternoon to all of you. I know it's a challenge to have an after lunch session, but the comfort level is the top order batsmen have done so well, middle order can take it easy. And with the comfort that the tail end is going to be a swashbuckling affair. So with that, let me give you a little broader context about technology and war, because these have been always intermingled. Right? If you talk about even more than 200 years ago, you know the French, how they were overcome by the British, just because of technology, certain technologies. There have been certain landmarks which have been made in terms of the invention of machine guns, aircraft and tanks in the 1920s, and so on. So there are landmarks. One major important landmark was the development of nuclear technology. Now, all these will happen, and many more things are coming, things which we have yet to understand completely. AI and ML, we talk very loosely, but the real impact of this has yet to be seen. And the kind of impact that we can visualize is something which is scary. At the same time, if we know it, we can plan for it. Quantum technology, drones, of course, we all know, But then we also don't know how many more things drones can do. Then there is this autonomous chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. Now, this is something which is a whole chapter by itself. So it's not as if one wants to talk in detail about any of these. But I'm just giving you the kind of openings that are coming up which are mind-boggling in nature and scope. I mean, you take any of them and we talk about autonomous kind of biological warfare is something which is so dreadful as to what it can do, genetic warfare and so on. So there are new things happening which we are actually in the beginning, the first elementary stage. Cyber tech has been talked about, electronic warfare. I mean, we all know like the example of one commander in Ukraine, how he was killed. All that happened was he was motivated to talk to his mother, and he talked on the phone, and that was the end. So there are so many things that are happening which are in a way dual technology. I think the major takeaway I would like to take, like the Gulf War brought in some glimpses of what real high technology can do and how technology can be projected. All of us saw the Patriot missiles and so on in action. But the use of dual technology to such a scale is something which the Ukraine war has brought to light. The kind of participation that has been there amongst the people, as Mr. Sarode mentioned about IT, the group for war, or whatever we call it, war group, that is something which means every single individual is really capable of participating in national defense, in a sense. Now, which of those individuals will participate, how they will participate, is a matter of detail. Now, one of the lessons, I would like to make use of certain lessons which have been enumerated. This was by the Harvard Kennedy School. They have drawn up 8 lessons from the Ukraine war. We can always add or subtract from any of them. First is the nuclear deterrence works. Now this is amazing because just imagine if Russia had not been a nuclear power, where would the war have ended? So nuclear deterrence even today works. That's one thing. Second is, and which was covered very nicely in the earlier sessions, economic interdependence does not prevent war. Globalization, being near each other, depending on each other, does not prevent war. That's the second model. The third is uneven economic interdependence can be weaponized. But even with this, the effect is very short term. Sanctions, for example, they can cost a lot for aggressors, but it cannot change short-term results of wars. Now, the other thing which is very interesting and more appealing to the younger crowd here, what it says is that outcomes of modern warfare depend not only on whose army wins, but on whose story wins. Now, this becomes so apparent, like we all saw the Ukrainian president in his t-shirt and making so many videos of himself. It gave a certain picture of Ukraine and it captured the imagination of people. And using these kind of social media, it is spread. Now that is also very important. It's a technology which we have yet to grasp in that sense. The other part is, and this was again very apparent and many of the generals and admirals are sitting here, we all must admit that soft power by itself does not win wars. It's the hard and soft combination which can win wars. And therefore, what the term that is nowadays uses is smart power, the combination of soft and hard, and that is really what we must aim for. In addition to that, cyber warfare has already been spoken. Now, there are many other dimensions to this. Now I want to come down to what really has impacted in concrete terms, because rather than talking about it in conceptual terms, what does it mean? The first time we are seeing a glaring example of integrated artillery. When I say integrated, we have always had artillery. Artillery will always be there for, I'm sure, decades to come, because that's one of the most important parts. But the level of integration that has happened, where I've read somewhere that within 30 seconds of a requirement, an actual round is fired. 30 seconds. It's all it takes, because there's a whole array of technologies which are really waiting to happen in terms of communication. Now, this is something which all of us know, many of us know. Many of us have strategized. There are plans in effect in India. Unfortunately, it's the implementation where we fail. So this is something very important. Now the second part is swarms. Now, we have all known about the swarm of 13 homemade kind of drones made of plywood or something, destroyed an S-400. Now, look at the kind of scale of impact, look at the input. This is something which is going to be there, it is a fact of life, and how are we prepared for it? So this is another impact. Starlink has been mentioned. I just want to clarify here that Starlink is a major program. He wants to put in from 42,000 satellites, out of which I think now he has put up to 2,000 on odd. Having said that, the kind of use of that technology for military purposes that Ukraine has made is remarkable. And this is something which we in India can certainly very easily imbibe because we have the basics with us. And because it is low Earth orbit satellites, it was very difficult to penetrate. This is something which is a big learning from this particular war. Now, as far as India is concerned, let us be clear, it is one of the most threatened countries in the world because it has got two nuclear capable neighbors and unfriendly neighbors at that. So it is going to happen that we are under continuous threat. There are a lot of things, and defense production, as he said, is a subject which I don't want to dwell in too much detail, except that we have had several policies coming every 3 or 4 years. Every change in government is a new defense policy, procurement policy. It's the name of the game. I think none of the policies in essence are bad. Where have we failed? It is always in implementation. We have all heard of FARP, the program for how we escalate our artillery strength. Years have gone by. The submarine program, it's pathetic, the kind of story it has gone through, and personally I've had a lot of interaction in that particular area. But it is something which we must be ashamed of. Now, the other side of the story is India as a country has a national trait. We generally go to sleep unless we are woken up by something very solid. What helped us to indigenize production in the beginning? It was the fall of the Soviet Empire. We were so dependent, and Soviet Empire collapsed, and we said we must do something ourselves. In recent times, I must say, although I won't be popular for saying that, but I must thank China for having woken us up at a very high cost, of course, but it has woken us out of a big, deep slumber. Policies are there, nobody implements it. Years pass, nothing happens, and this is the fate we are in. I'm sure you know that the India space program was because of denial of technology. It was because margin steel, the steel that was really required for making the rocket casings, was denied to India or actually offered at astronomical prices that forced Dr. Brahm Prakash took it on, and we developed that steel in India. Now, talking about where do we source, I want to just put across another point. We talked about critical technologies being available to India. Sorry, over the years, I'm clear, no critical technology will ever be provided to India. And I'm saying this with no exceptions. It may be an aircraft that you buy. The most critical part of an aircraft, as you would know from construction, is the wing. You'll never get the technology of how to design a wing. You may get the parts of some aircraft you manufactured. So when you talk about Atmanirbharta, first thing, it starts with self-esteem. Do we as Indians respect ourselves? That, unfortunately, is not happening. And having said that, do we conceptualize and design ourselves? There's no point in saying we will become Atmanirbhar by getting people to invest in India. When the time comes, you are left high and dry. This is no way of becoming really self-sufficient. You have to develop the capability of having the know-why, the IP in India, not having manufacturing done in India alone. Now, when it comes to certain steps which have been taken in the recent past, I must admit they are absolutely the right things. For example, the first, although late, but anyway, very, very important was the recognition that there is a cyber agency, a defense cyber agency. There's a defense cyber policy which hopefully will come out, and that is something so important for the country. And this is something which is going to therefore start people thinking. You know, the unfortunate tragedy in India is almost everything that is needed to be done has been said by somebody before this. All of this is known, but we don't put our heads together and actually continuously follow a strategy. Unfortunately, what happens, and if you compare that to China, what maybe Mao said or even before that, somebody keeps following that, and as a policy, whether because of a communist regime, they keep on following that time and time again, and over years and decades. Here, what happens to strategy? We are not talking about strategy what we do tomorrow. We are talking about how to save the lives of people for decades to come. We know what is going to happen, But where is that long-term strategy, long-term thinking, and whatever is thought about, is it carried forward by the next government or whatever the political party? That does not happen. We have had a National Security Advisory Board for donkey's years. I don't know how many people hear about it. Whereas those are the people who are tasked with this job of making long-term strategy. That, unfortunately, the continuity is not there. So essentially, I would like to quote a good sentence. It says, questions you cannot answer are usually far better for you than answers you cannot question. It's so true of the situation that exists today. So in summary, I would feel as an individual, and all of us here have got absolutely a moral duty that we, as educated people who form a small percentage of the total 1.4 billion, we have a duty to find out what is going to happen, prepare our population for their safety and well-being in the years to come. This is our bounden duty, and this is something which all of us have to do collectively. There's no question of, I belong to X organization or that party. There's nothing like that. It's a national need over a long term. Where are we doing that? And that is really what I would like to say is the biggest learning with this shock. Knowing that this is going to happen again, knowing that it's going to happen in a much better way, bigger way, what are we doing as an individual, as a group, and are we doing strategic national thinking, or is it narrow-minded political thinking? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kotwal. I think your anguish is shared by most of us here because we have seen the brunt of the lack of vision and lack of strategy in many fields. I remember I was told this story very recently. As you know, the Government of India has announced a drone policy, and the idea is to promote the use of drones for peaceful uses. Of course, with so many drones flying, there will be problems with security of vital installations, airports, and other locations. And so there is a friend of mine who is heading the anti-terrorist squad in a state. And poor fellow, he has no guidance about how to go about securing the airport in his city. So he got frustrated and he called all the drone vendors or drone sellers, they are not really even manufacturers, and said, you guys have created this problem, you give me the solution. And that is the kind of approach we have to solving problems, that we just do things which have absolutely no bearing on the problem, but occur to us that they might be of some use. I think what you mentioned about the cyber policy, cyber security strategy is in the works for the last 2 years. And it is actually a reflection of how seriously things are taken, or how much understanding is there about the complexity of these problems. Because as we know, strategy is like a map. So map is not territory. Map is just a map which will take you somewhere you want to go. If we take time in kind of drawing the map so much, how will we reach there if we have spent all the time only in planning and drawing that map? It's really unfortunate because this is one area we really have been working for a long time, and the national strategy still eludes us after 2 years. I remember in 3-4 years ago, these banks were getting hit by swift attacks. So attackers would come, infiltrate the server of a bank, and do financial transactions which would land up in other countries. And I think Pune had this Cosmos Bank case, which was where they lost 90 crore rupees in 5 hours. And RBI got really serious about it. And what they first did was they made it mandatory for all board members of banks to attend a cybersecurity training program and take a test at the end of it and get certified. Because the awareness begins only at the top, and if the awareness is not there at the top, then nothing downstream is going to happen. So I'm sure somebody is going to do this for the government and other decision makers and get them to understand what are the benefits and then what are the risks of technology. Sekat, your time for talking about special forces and other things that you would like to talk about.
Thank you, sir. Always a pleasure and a privilege to be on a panel as the same as you. Also, thank you, Pune International Center, XKDR, and Takshashila Institution for bringing me here. Pune is like a second home. So every time I go around saying, "Mi Punayatsa hai," everybody starts wondering about my name and how I know Marathi, and that raises always interesting laughs. But I think if I were to borrow the cricketing term that you used, I think the opening batsmen were not exactly in consonance. They were talking about two very vastly different things. One was very pro-indigenization, and one was saying that we need more strategic relationships because we can't do everything by indigenization. I'll try as the last batsman of this panel, but do a middle order thing and try and balance both of them. I'll also use some anecdotal examples because if you are looking for empirical data, then I suggest you read Dr. Rakesh Mohan's paper or Ajay Shah and Vikram Kelkar's book. They'll have the empirical evidence. I'll give you the anecdotal I'll start with that we keep looking at some of these problems piecemeal. So first and foremost, and this is something that the American military has developed and now they look at it very seriously, is comprehensive national power. And when we look at what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, we are still looking at it in piecemeal. We are looking at it from a foreign policy perspective. We are looking at it from a technology perspective. We are looking at it from an economic, military, etc., much like the seminar. But we are not really looking at it as one comprehensive national issue that there are various factors that we'll have to work on this together. And I'll give you several examples of that. For example, today, and surprisingly, the one institution in this country which has actually managed to bring together some of these vast amounts of different views and capacity building, capacities, etc., is actually the Foreign Service, and especially the Ministry of External Affairs, because if you see how they are structured, I think they were one of the first organizations to induct military people as a part of their diplomatic thing. They were one of the first ones to look at technology as an issue of diplomacy, and they had a joint secretary position. In fact, the first time, I don't know if Ambassador Bombawale will even remember this, the first time I met him was in the office of our current foreign secretary. At that time, he was JS Cyber, Mr. Quatra, and he just walked in because he was leaving India to take over as ambassador. So the MEA has structurally managed to do some of these issues of looking at things in a much more robust, much more holistic way. But I don't see any other organization making, even structurally. I'm not saying that the MEA experiment has succeeded or is succeeding. There are still many gaps, but at least they're making an attempt. They're putting their foreign service officers in places and in positions which is at least beginning to tackle. One very interesting example that I saw was when I went on a track 1.5 trip to China. We went to the Indian embassy there, and it's amazing to see how, I think probably from the mid-80s, and correct me if I'm wrong, how the Foreign Service has built their China bench, where they have looked at and invested in officers, not only understanding the language, but understanding the processes, etc. And today they had a line of people who speak the language, understand the culture, understand their history, diplomacy, etc., and could do a very authoritative take on China. And the only two people who could not understand a word of Mandarin in the Indian High Commission, guess who they were? Our intelligence rep and our military rep. So the point is that when we look at issues like Russia and Ukraine and what we are seeing from a technology perspective, because of this piecemeal approach, you will have the diplomat looking at technology, but the intelligence will not look at technology. The military will partly look at technology, but will partly look at something else. We never get a holistic perspective on what is going on. Domestically, what can we do from a policy perspective? While we've heard Pranay and we've heard Mr. Kotwal, how many of you have heard of something called the STIP? It's called the Science and Technology and Innovation Policy. It's something that we started in '53 in different names, and we've had different additions to it. We used to call it technology. First, we used to call it the science policy, then technology, science and technology. And since 2013, we now call it the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy. And it's still in draft status, and hopefully by next year, we'll have that STIP policy. But STIP policy is not looking at Russia and Ukraine. And why is it not looking at Russia and Ukraine? Because Department of Science and Technology, nobody's told them to look at Russia and Ukraine and figure out what are the issues that are coming up, so that as part of your science, technology, and innovation policy from the ground up, which also includes your education perspective, how will you come to a situation where tomorrow we will not only have partly the indigenous infrastructure that Mr. Kotwal talked about, but also the holistic approach to build the strategic partnerships that Pranay spoke of, because structurally, as a policy, we have now weeded it everywhere else. And if you read the draft policy, which is still there, you will find that it still is kind of anti-private sector. As a result, what happens is it still imagines that the best brains will be only in government and they will know everything, and the private sector should be kept at bay as much as possible, even though we are talking about innovation. And it's amazing how that STIP policy is coming up. So we tend to not look at, so nobody from the military is inputting into STIP policy, nobody from intelligence is inputting, nobody from foreign service is inputting. It's basically a group of scientists who are talking to each other, talking to similar institutions and saying, okay, this is what a science, technology and innovation policy should be. How do you therefore then work towards an innovation policy which will look at our future needs? I think structurally, part of our problem is that we use sometimes our 19th and 20th century structures to try and deal with issues which will come up in the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd century. Our information warfare capability being a classic example. The military, in piecemeal again, started creating certain kind of structures. General Shaukin Chauhan is there, and he was there as DDG, ADGPI, and then also at ADGPI. But it's again a 19th or 20th century structure which we are trying to use to try and deal with information operations which are very futuristic, very fast paced. And if you look at the one thing that is happening a lot today in Russia and Ukraine, it is the level of information warfare which is so sophisticated. And the best part is sophistication is not happening because of money. It's happening at very low cost but high impact. As a result, and as Mr. Sarvade pointed out, they outsourced, they made it an inclusive thing where Ukraine was looking at asymmetric warfare. So it, as the underdog, it started innovating much more and figured out how to take on a much bigger behemoth. So certain examples, for example, using drones and marrying them to your traditional artillery systems and seeing how we can now spot the enemy far away and then hit the enemy as quickly as possible. So several things happened very fast. Your command and control systems became much smoother. Your information systems, that C4 I square, what we call it, that you've spotted something, you've relayed that information back, that information has been analyzed, it has been sent to the person who will press the button, and then you hit the target. That loop is now getting closed in probably under a minute, mostly using our, open source or using off-the-shelf technology. And this thinking has not even started largely in India. And while people will come and argue with me, etc., I keep saying that while we keep talking about technology, don't forget, this is a country that has not been able to give the Indian military a decent fighting rifle since 1987. I mean, we use a joke of a rifle called the INSAS, which is fancily called Indian Small Arms System, and we haven't even been able to work at that level. What other kind of technology are we looking at? Also look at what's happening around the Russia-Ukraine in the periphery, where, for example, how are we looking at warfighting modeling systems? The use of huge algorithms, complex algorithms to understand what will be the outcome of the war. The Americans have been at it for a long time, and they created something called the Major Combat Statistical Model, which was created by the Naval War College and the NPS, Naval Postgraduate School, two organizations I have worked with in the past. And it's amazing how some of their predictions about the war are coming true. So if we are going to look at, and we have to look at some of these systems, not for anything else, because we could be the next Ukraine vis-a-vis China. So as a result, when you're looking at the asymmetry in technology and capabilities, etc., what are the kind of systems we are putting in place, and what kind of sourcing, etc., are we doing for having a robust technology, not only for our warfighting processes, but also for our overall technology growth, etc. Then, when it comes to, I've heard this many often, and one bureaucrat from the Ministry of Information Technology once told me, and this is very interesting, that one reason why we are not taken very seriously as far as technology is concerned, especially in an information technology framework, is because we are constantly a consumer of the internet. We are not a producer of the internet. When was the last time did you hear that we produce something in any form that has actually created the internet or more of the internet? Because we are constantly, even our services model, etc., we are still dependent on somebody else producing the technology or the infrastructure, and then we build services on it, which could, any day somebody wants to switch off the pipes or redirect the pipes somewhere else, our whole service industry will come crashing. So where are we developing technology or creating more of the internet rather than just consuming it. Unless we find that answer, I'm afraid we'll be in a situation where, again, another crisis will have passed by and we haven't really learned anything from it. Then I'll give you some examples from war fighting, what we are seeing, especially from an area that I'm a little more familiar with, which is cybersecurity. And there I'll break it up into two broad parts. One is overall cybersecurity, and then what we call critical information infrastructure, which is the CII. What is very interesting is that for the first time, if you see our legal history, the first time cybersecurity popped up as a term within our framing of laws was when we amended the IT Act in 2008. So from 2000 to 2008, there was no recognition also of cybersecurity as an issue till it finally came up in the law, and then it envisaged that we will have Section 70 and 70B, we'll have critical information infrastructure, and we'll have, for everything else, non-critical information infrastructure, we'll have another organization. That organization finally comes up several years after it was mandated in the law, and so far, it has been able to certify just about 3 systems so far. So this is the pace at which we work. The certification of a system as a critical information infrastructure, even that has not been able to take off, and we are talking about protecting it when hordes of people from the Chinese IT, etc., will be targeting our systems. The other mistake we are constantly making is we constantly feel that if we are able to protect the government, that's all that we need to protect, and we again heard this panel talk about it. But look at how policies work. So if Chinese were to try and hack into our systems, and they have used the North Koreans, for example, if you study the Kodankulam nuclear power attack, this was clearly done by a North Korean group, and we managed to speak to a South Korean researcher who could, with so much of confidence, even identify the kind of laptops that had been used to write that code and insert it into KKNP, etc. This is the kind of level. Nobody from India even bothered to talk to them. Well, forget about anybody higher up in the systems, even from our intelligence organizations, nobody spoke to them. They didn't even look at it this way. So whether you look at the Kodankulam nuclear power attack, or if you remember, there was something called the Hitachi Payment Systems cyber hack, which led to some 3.2 million credit and debit cards having to be recalled. And I think Mr. Rajnath Singh even mentioned this in Parliament, etc. There is no follow-up, and that is how exposed we are as systems. So if we look at the kind of information warfare that is taking place, and here you're talking about a country like Russia, which practically decided an American presidential election from whatever evidence that we have now seen. If that is the sophistication, and we are not able to even imagine what could be the possibilities, then how do we learn any lessons as far as technology is concerned? Which brings to my last 2 points. One is that I just came back from a NATO conference which was looking at the use of special forces in counterterrorism. And one thing that never stuck me, and all these, especially the Europeans, were talking a lot about, is how do we build resilience among the public for any counterterrorism attack, and then use that as a part of the posture that we'll have for employing special forces, etc. And I was like, why are you talking about resilience? I come from a country which has seen almost 100,000 deaths because of insurgency and terrorism, and bombings and stuff like that, thanks to our friendly neighbor in the West. So we have a lot of resilience, etc. But then I realized that what they were talking about was slightly more sophisticated. We are resilient because we have no other option, but they want to build resilience which will make the population much more protected against these kind of asymmetric warfare. And in a country which is extremely polarized, as we are now beginning to see in our politics, etc., we are just ripe for it doesn't take much for information operations to take place, where using minimal technology, so much of harm could be done to us. So are we even recognizing that as part of our wargaming, so on and so forth? And the last point that I wanted to make was that I think we keep forgetting this, and I don't see enough literature or discussions publicly about this, is a few years ago, we successfully managed to become part of the Wassenaar arrangement. And because we are part of the Wassenaar arrangement, now it opens up the scope to do a lot of, especially in cybersecurity, look at dual technology issues, build up the kind of strategic relationships that Pranay is talking about, while without compromising our indigenous capabilities, and for which you need other kinds of policy changes. But then if you are able to then exploit these kind of strategic wins that we have already had, and we are able to then build some foundations on this, we'll be much better prepared for not only what is happening because of the Russia-Ukraine war, but similar situation that we are put in. And finally, I'll just quickly end by saying that all this works if we also re-engineer some of our internal systems. Like for example, every time somebody from the military says to me, oh, I've been working on something classified, I interpret that as you're not working on something that is going to be of any use to anybody. And I've dealt with classified stuff, if you're really working on something classified stuff, don't talk about it. And if you are really doing something, stop looking at it from a lens of suspicion around people, because if you're going to talk like a nation, then this is very important. Much of your capacities and capabilities and innovation, etc., will lie beyond the structures that you work in, unless you find a systemic way to integrate that capacity and capability into your systems, which is where, going back to my original point of comprehensive national power, no matter how much of work you've done in classified areas, etc., we will never get there. And that Ukraine has shown us that don't bother so much about what is classified, non-classified, etc. And Mr. Kotwal, I think, mentioned that nuclear deterrence works. But look at us. We've actually shown through Balakot and through the Kargil war that nuclear deterrence may not work as much as we want it to work. We can still have conflict, and fairly kinetic conflicts despite the nuclear threshold. I have gone to Bangkok 4 times so far, twice to figure out how good we can kill the Pakistanis in war games, and twice how not to kill each other through track to peace talks. But the one thing that I've come out with all of this is that unless capacities in the private and the public sectors are integrated structurally, there is very little hope for us. Thank you.
I think the trust issues that Saikat mentioned are so endemic and deep. If you talk to, and I've spent half my life in government, more than half, and then some in private sector. And the lack of trust on both sides is really something to worry about. But on a different note, you probably recall the influence operations which countries launch. And after Snowden came out with the kind of scale of surveillance which US was able to do because everything was located there, there was this, I was reading a policy analysis on how government officers, say in India, have all their mails hosted in US. Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, everything is there. And it is very easily available for the local agencies without much legal process to be followed to look at what all you have been writing about and so on. Even iPhone, if you store your data in iCloud, that iCloud data is available by the same process that is that makes the mailboxes available. Now, this question was asked some government officers that why don't you, keep the data here? Why are you using firstly non-NIC addresses? Why don't you use Rediffmail, which is based in India? It may be another thing that they may also be hosting their servers there because the storage is cheaper there and so on, used to be. So the answer which came was that, okay, look, US government may be interested in me, but may not be able to do much about it. Google may not do anything beyond selling me ads. But if my government looks at my mailbox, there is going to be a lot of trouble for me because they can really misuse that data. And which is true because I spend a lot of time in law enforcement. The surveillance abilities and the surveillance which is mounted by multiple agencies in the government can be so large and so unaccountable because it is all under administrative orders. And how the data is used, where it will be stored, can it fall in wrong hands? As you know, the Neera Radia tapes were created by Income Tax Department, they fell in somebody's hands and they got published. So that lack of trust about the oversight, the the trade-off between storing here and storing there, that is something which tells us about how much distance we have to travel in really making India in that sense. So thank you for all your very interesting thoughts, my co-panelists. I want to go to the audience now for questions, and we'll start with Madam in the front row, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to take up a point that Saikat raised, which was, you talked about the fact that MEA was one of the first to really innovate a holistic approach when it came to looking at cyber policies. But if I could comment on that, Saikat, it was an uphill battle. I was Deputy NSA at that time, as you know, and for me to get MEA interested in looking at cyber policies as a separate subject from e-governance was very, very tough. I had many conversations, and they did not really see the incongruity of telling somebody who was dealing with e-governance to look after cybersecurity issues. Because e-governance, the purpose of e-governance is to get people to use it as much as possible. Cybersecurity is something else, cybersecurity policies. It was only in the time of Mr. Quatra, I think, that it really became a distinct position where the person only did cyber security and not the e-governance as well. The other reason was because the Foreign Secretary at that time, Nirupma Rao, was a great believer in the power of social media and understood the power. She backed this idea that we should have a dedicated presence. But it took 2 years of solid effort to build up that kind of capability. And later on, of course, now we have the nest, we have a whole structure, and everybody has recognized how important it is. But I can tell you, it was difficult even in the Foreign Service to do this, and you had to have a particular confluence of people who understood the importance of this for international diplomacy. So it's the luck of the draw, really. I can't say that it was something that we were open to it, yes, but it could just as easily have been people who were not open to it and said this is not important from a diplomacy point of view. Now this ad hocism has to go, this personalized approach has to go. It would be very easy for me to say, yes, the Foreign Service is full of brilliant diplomats who all recognize this, but it wouldn't really be true. And the second thing is the slowness with which we implement recommendations. The recommendations which you're talking about were setting up the critical information infrastructure procedures, etc. The 2008 amendment in the IT Act, etc. The talk about the new governance structure, data governance structure. The talk about the new cyber policy strategies. The talk about the new IT Act. All this talk that floats around. It takes years and years and years to implement, and first to pass the acts and then to implement them. So I'm afraid we are way behind the game. Our implementation rate is far too slow, and there is something fundamentally flawed in our system of decision making. And part of it is also the very quick turnover, in personnel in government, because each person who comes in wants a new system, whether it's at the political level, whether it's at the bureaucratic level, whether it's at the technocratic level, you really have a systemic problem here. And unless doctrines and policies are spelled out in very clear detail and every government, regardless of the party in power, agrees to keep to them, the kind of long-term planning you see in other countries is just not possible. So, I don't say this by way of a question. I don't expect anyone to have the answer, but I think I'm highlighting a problem here. And if anyone has better ideas how we can overcome this, I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to what you said, ma'am. It's very true that the slowness is frustrating, and sometimes I see a understanding issue also, because I'm open to correction here. My understanding is strategy has to be as open as possible. It has to be discussed, it has to be critiqued, and it has to be then adopted and then implemented. It is the operational details which have to be as confidential as possible. Now we see there is a great reluctance in government to actually share the thought process itself. They will suddenly announce something which then is found to be defective, impractical, unimplementable, and then they will roll back or they will issue some frequently asked questions, etc. So I think this openness in government is very important, and the ability to hold themselves accountable is also important. Now we have had the second Administrative Reforms Commission a few years ago. What is the progress card on that? Which recommendations have been accepted, which are in progress? What is the timeline? We don't see anything in public domain. We should have actually a good dashboard which shows month-on-month progress and so on. So I think we need to get that culture going, that we are accountable to people and we will announce what we are doing so that our successors also cannot roll back, because it is there in public domain and people will ask questions about why it is not being, why the vision is not being fulfilled.
Good afternoon, I'm M. Marshal Chaudhary. I think the first couple of sessions also alluded to it indirectly, and it's come out pretty openly right now, is the absence of an enduring strategy. And I think George Tanham, when he trashed us that Indians don't do strategy, we were all up in arms, but I don't think we've done anything beyond that for a point. And we all know strategy is extremely hard to understand, extremely difficult to do. It needs vision, and the biggest challenge is it has enormous amount of unintended consequences, which is, makes it the first reason to jettison a strategy. So I think the challenge here is that in our country, I don't think we have invested in educating and understanding, or in the knowledge, creating a knowledge domain on the understanding of a strategic approach as a nation. And that is something I think we have been sadly lacking. So I would love it if anyone has any suggestions as to how we can deal with that, because that is something missing in all our education and all our training and everywhere.
Yeah, I'll attempt to address this issue. Basically, I agree with you. This is what I also was mentioning. But what are the remedies? See, fora like these, where people from various disciplines come together and put forward their experience, if we put up as a very strong kind of feeling amongst people that we need to partake of the strategy. For example, China has published a complete strategy of how they will integrate science and technology into the whole mainstream, right from education to the end. The STIP, which you mentioned, is something which has been given a different kind of treatment. What they do is they publish a whole policy, circulate by email to thousands of people, and they don't get many responses. At the end of it, they say that we have consulted so many people and this is how we have formulated the policy. Consultation doesn't happen that way. The mechanisms exist in the country. I don't think we have to invent anything. It is just that we have to revive them, and if public bodies like PIC and others, if we keep making this point, I'm sure there will be some kind of understanding of the whole need for it. And this is something which is easily doable. It's just that, for example, you have your budget, every year you get discussed, right? The finance minister calls a group of industry people, whether it's public or private sector, there's discussion. It's become a formal kind of a system. Now, is there something we can do to revive the NSAB? In a sense that, okay, what is the participation? Who are the members of it? Can we, I was even suggesting that PIC becomes a motivating factor or some kind of a nodal agency to have some relationship with NSAB. If all converge, I think it's still possible. I'm still a little optimistic in that. Thank you.
Pardon me, but I wanted to respond to this for the simple reason that I've heard this for the last 25 years, that we don't have a strategic culture and we are not educating people, etc. But if we are to blame or find somebody to blame, I would say we would blame people in government, blame people in the military, blame people in the intelligence or police services. Why? For the simple reason that continuity, turnover, etc. that ma'am just spoke about. Because of the kind of roles when you are in uniform, etc., you will have different, and also your career paths. Like I understand the army a lot better. So somebody who's been a section commander, platoon commander, then company commander, then has to prepare for JC, senior command, or NDC, or whatever, all your courses, etc. you want to grow in your career. You have to keep doing different kinds of roles. And we've tried to understand that from a special forces perspective, because that has a huge impact on operational roles, etc. But where does that continuity actually come from? In successful militaries, that actually comes from civilians. but how many civilians have you actually incorporated where you could have certain functions done only by civilians who will develop a certain kind of expertise, who will hand over that expertise from one air marshal to another as generations of people move forward. Everybody is so focused in keeping people out that nobody has allowed anything to come in. As a result, structurally, we have destroyed that strategic culture. And unless that is fundamentally changed, we will always be surprised, we will always have a Kargil, we will always have a Galwan, we will make all the right noises, but we will never learn our lessons. Just to give you two more examples from the cybersecurity field, I am part of, which is Asia's biggest cybersecurity conference. We hold it in Goa every year. Every time we go back to somebody in the government, asking them to come and use it like the Americans use it at Black Hat, NSA supports it, the ministers go, they go and not only find what is happening in cybersecurity, they recruit hackers, etc. In our country, the first question I get is, who else have come as keynote speakers, what is their stature, then I'll decide whether to come. And then the next question will be, will you put us up in this suite of this hotel or this suite in that hotel, etc. There is no conversation about how can I interact with the cyber, and this is India's biggest cybersecurity community, has lakhs of information security professionals. They come up with crazy stuff at the conference, but nobody is engaging them. I finally managed to get one of our intelligence agencies to come sit, and they have started some work, but then again it depends on who is heading that agency. One person wants to continue with more programs with them, the next person comes and says, no, we'll start everything new, and shuts off everything. And these things takes years to build, as you well know. Capacities don't happen overnight. So who's to blame for it? It's our structure which is responsible for it, and unless we don't recognize it, I don't see any hope.
Hi, Ranjit Rane. I am a technology policy researcher, very particularly posing this question to non-military leadership and experts on the panel in the presence of military leadership and experts. Considering that our next war will involve what will effectively be a information warfare force, how do you suggest that we raise, arm, retain, and continually improve such a force, looking at the Ukraine war? Thank you.
Okay, I will attempt this answer. So the problem, and in full disclosure, Ranjit used to work with me when we were in an organization together. But this problem of attracting technology talent to government organizations is a very difficult problem to solve in India. Primarily because India is such a hot market for IT skills that people who have done civil engineering, people who have done metallurgy are straight away going into IT. They are recruited without any specialized and then trained and put on jobs and so on. Now, with this kind of scenario, and they are paid dollar salaries, so the compensation levels are going up every year by 8-10% or even more, depending on the role they are doing. In this situation, to attract people to government and keep them productive, engaged is a tough task. I think there was a policy decision by Government of India a few years ago to relax the HR framework of the government to attract technology talent. Unfortunately, that policy declaration I have not seen at least getting translated into special recruitment drives or special schemes and so on. Now, the challenge that, the problem that Ranjit mentioned, to my understanding, can be solved by creating special dispensation for attracting people. They will come for some time, they have to pay decently well, and then they will move on because they either get bored or they want to go abroad, they have their own personal motivations. So you have to build a good pipeline of such people. You have to start with internship programs, you have to go to colleges, you have to get them excited about the purpose that you are going to present them to work on. And then you have to have knowledge management, the question we were just discussing. How we codify, capture, and make this knowledge available within the organization will be critical to how these resources are used, because they are going to move on, that is a given. So you need to have core cadre, which will be the managerial cadre, and the operative roles will come from these kind of arrangements which are contractual, short-term, and which are going to be where people will be replaced. So I think that to me looks a framework. That is my attempt to answer this. But if anyone has thoughts on this, it will be good to hear them.
No, I don't have a thought, but I just want to. I can't answer that question, it's been raised. But I do want to ask the economist a question linked to what you're saying and what he's saying. My perception, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we are a country that has understood labor arbitrage. When are we going to translate or shift from labor arbitrage to knowledge arbitrage? Unless we value knowledge arbitrage, just like him will never get a job. So what does the economist have to do to tell the government or anybody else where the shift will take place? We are still a colony. Earlier we were not independent, now we are independent, but we are still a labor colony in Bangalore. We are not aggregating knowledge arbitrage as our value. So any of the economists can answer it, please. What is required to be done to shift? Otherwise, we will remain labor arbitrage.
I'm not an economist.
Probably you can take a stab at it.
I can't get a solution for it, but I must say that when one sees the kind of enthusiasm and quality of thought which is there amongst the so-called startup community, okay, one does get confidence that there is a lot of talent available. Unfortunately, to my mind, the belief is that startups will generate an economy of their own. It will not happen because you have to create an ecostructure for supporting them. But to answer this question, one of the thoughts could be, like if you tomorrow have a kind of a competition and select the best of people who will join a select group of young people who will then formulate or help formulate the next steps in cyber strategy. There will be a lot of very knowledgeable and interested people who will come forward. Now the next step, how to get them on a continuity in this and give them the right emoluments. That is a manageable problem. The first is to change the mindset from making some object and flying it and then somebody saying this doesn't work or where have you got the experience for. Now you go to the knowledge side, as you rightly said. You ask for that kind of people to begin with. That is a specification, not create a toy and then say now does it work for military purposes. But you look at the design aspect and I'm sure there will be talent available. This is what my suggestion is.
Ajay, you wanted to say something?
There's a ladder of quality, and in every country, industries connect into globalization at relatively modest levels of skill, and then build on a ladder of quality from there. Labor-intensive manufacturing in China was extremely primitive, and all credit to them, hats off to them, I admire them. They have really built something remarkable in the world of electronics, in the world of computer engineering today. They built that quality. And similarly, I don't quite share your pessimism about what is happening in India in software. Whether you think of Bangalore, whether you think of Pune, I think in the last 30 years, it is revolutionary growth. The kind of capabilities, the product companies, the software as a service world, the kind of technically complex problems that are being done by global companies recruiting development centers in India. I think a lot has changed, and I'm optimistic that we are on a journey to somewhere.
Yeah, agree with this. Yesterday, Admiral Srikhande was talking about this quote about how people are more important than ideas, are more important than things, right? So in a similar way, I think we would be uncharitable if we are saying that it's a labor colony, in the sense that a lot of work which is done, like Ajay was saying, it's a trajectory that we've started. And now if you see, just in software, a lot of product development that happens is phenomenal. It wasn't there probably when we started, but it has changed. I can talk specifically about semiconductor design because I've worked in that area. There has been a significant change given, like, mostly probably every big company in the world which manufactures chips has design centers in India. There are Indian engineers which probably touch every chip which goes into the world. Yes, it is true that they are working for US companies or European companies based out of Bangalore, but we now have that capability, that knowledge, to do that on our own going ahead, you know. So now there are already, I have interviewed a few hardware startups which are coming up. There's a lot of work happening on analog chip design, etc., which is happening. So, you know, that change will happen, and we can see it happening, and it's a trajectory which we are on. So I am not so pessimistic about that.
So I don't think this was addressed, but I want to open it up to the panelists and anybody here. But there was a lot of funding that was channelized through digital currency in this war. So whether it's for Ukraine or Russia. So, and this will have to be a policy change within India or all around the world, which is cryptocurrency, digital currency, all of that. So how do you think we can address this at this point, and what should we be thinking about going forward as the next generation?
So I didn't get the question fully. So the crypto assets or currency was used to donate to Ukraine, and I think the Russians also attempted to send out money through crypto channels because of the sanctions, etc. But crypto is I'm giving just my personal perspective on this, I would think, a passing phenomenon, though there's a lot of noise around it. A lot of people have actually invested into learning blockchain-related courses, and it used to be a very hot skill also. I think it might still be. But in general, the kind of hope and optimism people had, which I thought was unrealistic, because if you look at the core functions of a government, they are defense, currency, foreign relations, and law and order. So there's no way government is going to give up on currency, which was the original use case for crypto assets. I don't call them cryptocurrency. Now, they don't have any intrinsic worth or any economic value by themselves. That is just about speculation, or there will be some specific niche cases which might come up for the blockchain technology, but definitely not a very widespread adoption. In that kind of situation, I think we have been a little slow in regulating it, and it led to a lot of people investing influenced by the influencers, etc. But I think government has been talking about this, clearly warning people not to fall for it. RBI has been trying to stop access to banking channels, etc., going into legal battle and so on. I think we could have been more proactive, like countries like Singapore, UAE actually regulated it very early, and they said that only HNIs with certain net worth will be able to invest into cryptocurrency, crypto assets, and others will not be able to. So it kind of kept it to those who could afford and who wanted to speculate. But I don't see it as something becoming mainstream financial product, though it's not, I don't think it's linked to the theme in that sense, though Ukraine provided some example of how money could move from here to there. But I think most of the donations to Ukraine would have come through normal channels, not the crypto channels. Anybody else wants to?
Whereas crypto is one thing, but I don't think we as a country can stay away from digital currency and the use of blockchain. That is something which probably needs to be done in any case. Crypto is another application of it, which probably no government, as you said, might really do away with that control on currency.
So this whole rise of central bank digital currencies happened as in response to the crypto craze in that sense. But if you see the most ambitious and successful implementation of CBDC has happened in China. And they did it as a challenge to the digital transactions which were happening on privately initiated mobile payment channels. And they also had the social credit scheme in mind, where they wanted to control the currency and study the usage patterns, etc. So it was a very different motivation. I don't think we have the same motivation. In any case, the digitization of payments, which would be the outcome of a CBDC adoption on a large scale, especially in those countries where it is not mainstream, is already achieved in India by UPI, which maybe could have an alternative system just for resilience purposes. But the use case for CBDC and CBDC on blockchain, to my mind, are a little weak. But that's probably a discussion we could have later. So if there are no further questions, I would request my co-panelists to give some final thoughts, 1 minute, like the morning session.
Yeah, I was just noting down some more sort of ideas going ahead. So, for example, Saikat mentioned about collaboration and strategic collaboration in the tech sector. So, one of the things that my colleagues have been working on is, for example, in space, things like the Artemis Accords, which are talking about moon and settlement over there and returning there by 2025 kind of work. Those are opportunities that exist, and those are things that India can be a part of, and it will help build India's own capabilities. So that was one, and yeah, I just had this nice quote which the historian of technology, David Edgerton, talks about how national innovation doesn't always produce national economic growth. In the real world, it's global innovation that produces national growth and national innovation that produces global growth. So I think that's something to remember when we are talking about the high-tech sector.
I'll just reiterate some of the things that I said. One is that, for example, policy. In the military, we have this term called ORBAT, which is your order of battle, etc. The ORBAT has now expanded tremendously, as we are seeing from the Russian-Ukraine war and future conflicts. So the local general population, etc., is as much a target as your military assets or your strategic assets. In a situation like that, for example, in cyber, if we are going to say encryption and end-to-end encryption is the last word in protecting ourselves from any kind of a hack, etc., you can't also have a policy saying that no, but we can't have end-to-end encryption because our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies are not able to look into some of this. So you can't let exceptions become the rule. We have to look at it in a much more holistic perspective and see what works best for us, not let us be dictated by our inadequacies and our failures. Like we spoke about strategic autonomy, and the first thing in my mind was, are we exercising strategic autonomy as a strength or as a necessity, or because we lack any other option and we are desperate for certain kind of technologies, so we cover it up by calling strategic autonomy. So we have to look at things in a much more holistic, comprehensive manner, which we therefore bring in CNP, and we have a much bigger participation of people, not only within government, but outside government to have the best available.
I just wanted to mention a few concrete things which probably could be done. You must have all heard of the famous Zu-23 and L-70. They were designed in the 50s, and today they've been reconditioned with the most modern kind of equipment, and it has become a modern weapon. There is a huge potential, in my opinion. If you look at the entire inventory, first of all, the entire inventory, what is the quantum of it? I don't know whether anybody knows in the armed forces. It's huge, I can tell you that much. It will be in thousands of crores. In that, if there's an overview taken of which are the ones which, see, we will always be short of funds for capital investment. There's no chance that we'll be anything else. But look at what we have and see what we can upgrade. And there's a huge potential I can see for that. That's one part. Second is, we talked about these futuristic technologies. Let there be a next tech organization. Something where young people are part of that organization, and of course maybe guided by some of the oldies, but finally they are the people who are going to face these things. They also know what are the new exciting technologies. Let there be an NTO, something like a next tech organization coming into being, which can then formulate some kind of far-reaching steps which probably we could do. And of course, coming to the education side, AI and ML, we talk so much about it. For example, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore has excellent people, knowledgeable, but very few in number. So if we target that that's an area where India has a strength and can make a mark, now is the time to really act on it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thank the panel for their thoughts. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Over to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarvade, and the distinguished panelists for this interesting session on technology in the Ukraine war, opportunities and challenges.